Should we say good morning, good afternoon, happy
Yeah,
MLK Day?
I'm gonna open and then. Good morning, everyone, and welcome and happy Dr. King Day. My name is Commissioner Jackie P. Taylor, and I'm so happy to be with you today. This is our first session on the topic of code switching. The theme of this year's MLK Youth Conference is Youth, We Hear You. So we would be remiss without hosting a session to acknowledge, to validate, and to respect the way our youth communicate. Whether you're spilling the tea, feeling salty towards somebody, or walking into a situation where you're just like, bruh, it is clear that our millennials, you all have a language of or your own. Dr. King was actually a master of language and nuance. In his letter from Birmingham jail, where several white clergymen actually called his protests unwise and untimely, he was very careful to choose his words and his vernacular to make sure that his point was fully understood by the audience that he was writing the letter to. And now that letter is one of the most prolific written works. He even references in the letter the words of one of the older Black women who decided not to ride the segregated buses. And he called it ungrammatical profundity when she said, "My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest." So today, youth, we're going to talk about that switch up that you all do so well. What it is, what it truly is, which is a skill, and how you can manifest it for power and for influence. But before we get into it, I want to introduce my co-panelists today. My first panelist is Dr. Shawan M. Worsley. She's the owner of A. Marie Counseling Services, a private practice in psychotherapy in Northern California. She's also the founder of the Center for Culturally Responsive Clinical Training, a social change agency that provides culturally responsive training to therapists and to counselors. Now, although she is one of the coolest people that I know, she is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed professional counselor. She holds a PhD in American Studies, a master's in counseling psychology, a bachelor's in African American Studies, and another bachelor's in international relations. So give a virtual welcome and say hello to Dr. Worsley. Hey, Shawan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And then I'm also going to introduce Nigel Talley. Now, Nigel Talley is the current Senior Vice President of A&R at Alamo Records, and he's previously worked with artists such as Mace, Waka Flocka Flame, Gucci Mane, and many more. Talley is leading the charge as a music pioneer and an executive as it relates to the current state of music industry in this streaming era. So before we get started, you guys, this is a dialogue. And so it's a little different from the event so far. I want you to look in your chat and answer this question. Before we jump in, how many of you already know what code switching is? Type 1 for yes and 2 for no. So if you know what code switching is, just type a 1 in there. And if you're curious and want to learn more, type 2 for me. Okay. So we've got some good responses. So I'm going to ask both Nigel and Dr. Worsley. So Dr. Worsley, what is the definition of code switching?
So code switching is just simply alternating between two languages, right? It's being fluent in one language and then being able to express yourself just as clearly in a second language. And you have code switching in terms of language, but you also have cultural code switching, which is adjusting your style, your speech, your behavior when you're with someone of another culture.
That makes sense. So Nigel, from your perspective, what's code switching and where do you see it?
Well, I think code switching is just depending on how you grow up. So I believe a lot of kids grow up in, the kids that we're dealing with, they grow up in inner cities. So I think, being outside and acting a certain way. And once you get inside a certain scenario, you have to adapt your environment. You have to adapt to your environment. So I would assume code switching would be that. And I think a lot of people in the industry do it, depending on the rooms you walk in. You have to adjust, you have to turn on your professionalism a little bit more. So I think in all different fields, you deal with code switching just based on where you grew up and how you grew up.
And I think, probably a lot of our youth can relate to it. I mean, just a scenario, if you're sitting on the phone and you're talking to someone and having a somewhat professional conversation, and then all of a sudden somebody walks in and you say, "Hey, what's up?" You go from "hello, how are you?" to "what's up?" Your entire demeanor changes, your language changes.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense. And then many of our youth Sure.
I've seen Obama code switch. I've seen Obama walk down, give people handshakes. Oh, what's up, my brother? And then do a different little dab. Everybody does it.
Everybody does it, and it's truly a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Worsley, you wrote your dissertation on the topic of culture and its influence on identity. So I'm just translating that to some of the youth. When we talk about code switching that the youth actually do, how much of it is actually part of who they are? So in other words, if we as educators and parents don't respect it, are we actually also not respecting who they are as a person?
Absolutely. Language has always been one of the primary ways in which people express their identity, right? Express their culture. And it's a beautiful art form, right? And the ways in which people use words are really a great part of their life. And as adults, when you speak, we should really listen because it may sound like a different language, right? But what does it open up for us? What does it show us about life that we don't see because we're living differently, right? And so code switching really offers something to everyone if you can just open your mind to it and to what someone is really exposing you to.
That's a good point, because I know as a parent, there have been a number of times when my children may not say things using, common English, and I'll say, that's not proper English, or don't say that. So is there a such thing as proper English?
Yes. So there is formal language, right? When you go to school and you're taking that English class and you're learning grammar and the vocabulary, there is formal English that you do want to master, right? And we can talk about all the reasons that you do, but it is very important. At the same time, that the informal language that you use is also equally important, right? Because that's the way that you're connecting with people, and that's the way in which you're expressing yourself. Now, the savviest people are excellent in both arenas.
Me to my next question. Nigel, when I think of some of the dopest artists and lyricists out there, they are the artists that can master, like have super vocabularies. They obviously are in touch with our culture, but they have super vocabularies, and they're like, I think of Nas. And when you think about artists who have done that, which our youth should aspire to, right? Mastering proper English as well as, being colloquial and mastering the vernacular. Who are the artists that come to mind that really do a good job of code switching?
I say, I think Jay-Z is like one of the ultimate code switchers. I mean, to everybody listening now, it may be like, Jay-Z may be somebody's grandfather's age, roughly. But I think Jay-Z is amazing at it. I believe J. Cole is amazing at it. I believe Kendrick Lamar is really good at it. I also believe that, a lot of artists, like what I've learned is that, when you see them in one fashion, you think that they're artists. And they say, what I'm saying? And they may use specific words that would lean them towards, growing up in an urban setting. But a lot of these guys are really smart. Like they're like reading books, they're sitting down with doctors, and they're having sophisticated conversations. So I like to think that a lot of the artists that are out there, a la Nas and, even like Fabulous, like some of these guys are really, really smart, but I just feel like they don't put themselves, or we don't hear them in settings where you can see how smart they are and how well versed their language is.
The youth that are watching along, if you could share that, and I think some of you have some examples, and from your perspective, of really, really good lyricists, people who have mastered from a traditional educational perspective, the language and communication, but then have also, they're relatable. You feel like they're one of the most relatable artists. And I see Lil Wayne in there, Common a few times, Lil Uzi Vert is in there. Will Smith, that's an interesting one.
I've never seen Will Smith really code switch, but maybe, who knows?
The switch game is a little bit on the spectrum of switching, right?
Yeah,
Shawan, we were talking earlier, and you made a good point around how important it is from a business perspective for these artists to be able to switch up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So you really want to think about using language strategically, right? So if you're trying to be an artist, you want to have mastered your formal language, right? Because there are contracts, there are negotiations, there are deals, right? But there are also promotions. So you need to be able to get up in front of people and speak eloquently. Now, the flip side of that is that if you're an artist, people are coming to you for what you can represent and what you can bring to them, right? Which is something new and different. And that's all about you. That's all about what you hold personally. So you want to be able to fully bring that to the world, right? With all of the nuances that you have. And the people who are able to do that can create bridges, right? Between their culture and another culture, but also opportunities, right? Almost anything can be monetized, right? And so when you're able to explain that and cultivate it, you can really create wonderful opportunities for yourself.
So can I add to that? I think the most important thing is just the information, because I think, or how to articulate the information you have. You know what I mean? Because I feel like, you have guys that are in meetings, and artists they are who they are. They don't know how to switch. But if they have the proper information, to some people it may come off as a little direct and a little aggressive. But I feel like if you have the proper information and you're able to articulate yourself really well, you don't really need to code switch, because they're going to accept you for who you are and what you bring to the table. It's just the fact that you have to have the information and know how to articulate it.
So you make a really good point, and it's a good segue into something I wanted to discuss, and that is, how does code switching or not being able to code switch influence how people perceive you? Because we all have biases in one way or another, but your ability to communicate and how you do that absolutely influences how people perceive you. So before we get into the topic, because I want to hear from Dr. Worsley and from Nigel on examples of people either getting the wrong impression positively or negatively, I want to ask you guys as youth, have you ever had a scenario where you have tried to explain something to an adult and they just don't get it? They are disconnected. Like, you have tried 8 ways to Sunday to try to figure out how to say it and you disconnected. Type 1 for yes and 2 for no.
We're all guilty of that.
Yeah.
I know, perception. So as they're bringing in their answers and letting us know, what their experience has been, Dr. Worsley or Nigel, either one of you can take it first. Let's talk about the realities of how people perceive folks that do code switch and folks that can't.
You want to start, or you want me to start?
Go ahead, Nigel, you take it.
Well, I like to think, like, as again. So I work at a record label, and before I was at a record label, I was a part of a production company, and our job was to find artists and bring them to different labels and try to land recording deals. And one of the 2 or 3 executives that I ran across that are just who they are. I worked with Puff for many years, and I think Puff doesn't code switch. I think Puff is more like he's a visionary, and in working with him, you may think he's crazy, and you may think like, oh, he yells at people and he talks to any people any kind of way. But usually people that work like that, they have one goal in front of them, and that's the only thing they focus on. They don't know how to kind of like, delegate and kind of talk a little sensitive to different people. So Puff is one of those people that are like, he's very, very, he's like a tyrant, so to speak. Like, he's one way and he's focused. And Dame Dash is another guy that I had the pleasure of dealing with. And, to the general public, he seems like he's very like, he just seems very aggressive and not smart. But Dame is very a well-rounded businessman, but it's just, the way he delivers his message just comes off really aggressive. But, for me, I believe, it's not about the it's not about like how the message is delivered. It's about the message. So I think it all reverts back to just having the proper information and knowing how to use what the information to kind of best represent you.
Now, you gave some really good, and I'm going to let Dr. Worsley also reply, but you gave some really specific examples of people who have been able to achieve success despite their inability to code switch. But I would say that this is an opportunity for the youth that are watching. If you see this and you know this, just like you're learning your math, your language arts, your reading, sciences, and you need to really get fluent in communication, because that's essentially all we're talking about.
That's correct.
To communicate to people and throw the ball in a way that your person that you're talking to can catch it. So I think, you make some really good examples, but I feel like Puff, Dame Dash, those are the exceptions. The ability to communicate and convince and influence people, it's a real skill and will really step up your power game. Shawan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think when you have great people, right, and visionaries, their talent does make room for them, right? But I think as a general principle, you want to think about what gives you the greatest assets, what gives you the greatest ability to really accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And, we live in a society where there are these rules and there are these norms, right? And people say, if you do this, then you can have this. If you speak this way, then we're going to think you're smart, or we're going to give you an opportunity. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying you got to know that it exists, and then you want to decide what to do about it. So I think getting the skill set is important, but I also think just as important is actually using your words, right? Because maybe this is something you want to fight against. Maybe this is something that you want to change in our society, right? Maybe this is something that you want to say, hey, just because we don't speak in this way doesn't mean there isn't something magnificent about the way we're speaking. And let's open up your mind, right? So I think the big point is you have options, use them, and be intelligent, right? When you go out into the world and know what you're dealing with, and then intentionally make moves.
Well said.
A lot of youths out there that are looking to make serious power moves. And I know on behalf of the MLK Commission and even all of us, we are here to help you make those moves. And so I want to talk a little bit around the two sides of the coin. So one piece is, as adults who are trying to help empower our youth, us being sensitive to the cultural nuances and their communication style so we can hear them. And then the other side is what we spent most of the time on, which is our youth understanding the value of code switching, so that depending upon no matter who they're talking to, they're able to influence and really leverage that as power. So when we talk about our ability to understand our youth, I would love our youth to kind of share some examples or ask some questions in the chat, so that we get the benefit of your experiences, and then also we can address some of your questions. I saw someone also mentioned, what about people who are on the spectrum? So I know in New Jersey, I believe our stat is 1 in 3 students are on the autism spectrum. One of my sons is actually also on the autism spectrum. And I know that varies. That spectrum is wide, from nonverbal to verbal to being super literal. What are some language nuances that we can talk about that may speak to some of our students who may be on the spectrum? Dr. Worsley, you want to address that?
So in terms of challenges or ways of overcoming challenges?
So the question was just asking about students that may be on the spectrum. So maybe we should just address it from the perspective of some suggestions on how you can leverage the power of language to be more effective.
So, we've come a long way just in education and in society about understanding the differences in people and the differences in the way that they learn, but also in the way that they experience the world, right? And when we're talking about someone being on a spectrum, it's partly the way that they receive information and partly about the way that they express it, right? So if you are someone who is on the spectrum, then you first want to utilize your resources in order to get a better understanding of exactly what that is, right? It's a big category, right? But there are so many resources, there's testing, and you are entitled to it, right? In this country, you're entitled to it. So you want to talk to people, you want to talk to your teacher, talk to your parents, and ask them to get you tested if you feel like you're struggling in this ways. And then there are all sorts of skills that you can learn, right? Communication is a skill. It seems like it's just something natural, right? Just something that you just do. You're just born doing this. You're actually not, right? And you can grow in it. And language is dynamic and it's evolving, and your ability to use it is that. So you never want to be discouraged, right? Because no matter where you are in terms of your abilities, there's all sorts of ways to grow and learn and to change the game, right? Because then there are people who take whatever adversity that they're facing, whatever challenge, and then they do something totally different. And we go, oh, and now, we have a whole different way of engaging. So just be encouraged.
That's great advice. So Nigel and Shawan, first of all, let me just add to that. I think that a lot of students, not all, you can't generalize, but many students on the spectrum actually gravitate towards music. So it's interesting on the influence that music can have in just helping to shape, right, communication and opening them up. Someone mentioned, and I think this is an interesting take, but someone mentioned I code switch all the time and it's exhausting. Does anybody want to take that and talk a little bit around, the struggle related to having to code switch? Because that gets into the whole diversity and inclusion topic, but I think it's worth.
I'm gonna let the doctor handle that, because fortunately in the business that I'm in, like, people tend to accept you for who you are. You know what I'm saying? As long as you know your job, you're able to deliver on your job, and you're able to, monetize relationships and maintain relationships. In my field, we don't really, it just depends. When you go up higher, the higher you go, you may have to switch at that point. But even depending on how high you go, if you've done your job, you walk in with who you are. You really don't really have to code switch. But you should always be able to adapt to your environment.
All right. So I'm trying not to be too political on MLK Day, right?
The topic of the title is keeping it real, code switching. So we have to keep it real.
All right. So for real, the reason that we have code switching is because of power structures, right? And it's saying that one culture is the norm, right? And there's this hierarchy. And so then in order to exist and in order to benefit, then you need to participate in that culture, right? That's the right culture. And Americans have been pushing back against this for all time, right? So there's something radical to code switching, though, right? And it's saying, I see you even if you can't see me. Now watch what I could do with this. And
wait, slow down on that point. Slow down on that point, because I don't want anybody to miss that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of my research is on African Americans, right? And in our history, we have utilized code switching to protect ourselves, right? To fight, to advocate, and to get what we needed, right? So sometimes people think, oh, well, you're selling out if you're speaking a certain way, or you're acting a certain way, or are you really just figuring out how to get what you need to get? Especially if you're moving in and out in particular moments, right? So that ability to code switch just shows the level of your intelligence, right? That you can see a whole nother world, take it in, and then articulate it back to them without them even knowing that you're operating in a second language.
So what's interesting is, I'm going to say this, but I would love you to, if you speak more than one language, type 1. If you only speak English, type 2. But as we're looking for people to, so multilingual, 1 language, 2. I think that there's code switching on so many levels. There's the example that Nigel gave of like cultural code switching, where you may say hello, but with someone else, you may dab them up. That's a code switch. Also, I grew up in Brooklyn. It is a melting pot of cultures, and everything from, talking to your friends, and then all of a sudden they start speaking in Spanish, and then they go back to English. That's code switching. It's with language, and it's hard, but it's code switching. To I know one of my good friends was my neighbor, and she was from Trinidad. And let me tell you something, she could speak the way we're speaking right now, and then all of a sudden
when she get angry,
that's why, and you're like,
that was my mom.
Exactly. And that's code switching. But I will take it to another level for our youth to understand. So there's language, there's culture, but then, we're getting into like neuro-linguistics. But if you're talking to a child, you may change your demeanor, you may talk softer. When you're talking to your pet, you change, your intonation and things like that. That is in fact code switching. You are morphing to be able to more effectively communicate with, to build trust with, and to connect with someone else. That's the skill. That's what we need to continue to master. And that's what really will contribute to our joint success. Any other commentary from our panelists on that?
I just didn't really answer the part around the cost, of code switching, right? And it is a type of labor, right? It's a type of mental labor that you engage in. People who are highly skilled in it can do it without thinking about it. But like Nigel was talking about, in different situations, the stakes can be higher and the engagement may take on a different intensity, right? So I would really say you don't ever want to not be yourself, right? What you want to do is think about how you communicate that identity the most effectively. And some ways, in some situations, one way works, and another way works. And when you do that, that decreases the emotional load because you're not trying to be something you're not, right? It's just like, am I going to wear this shirt this day or this shirt this day? Am I going to put my makeup on or am I going natural? Like whatever it is, how you're trying to flow in any given moment. And
Right.
that's not being something who you're not, because I think that's when people start to feel a strain when they're trying to be like somebody else. Don't try to be like somebody else.
Be
Just do
authentic.
you in the best way you can.
Right. Nigel, 30 seconds, closing remarks.
I would say, I think the information is key. I think depending on who you're talking to, know what you're talking about. And if you learn the art of code switching, you're really gonna go far in life. But you can't really code switch unless you have the information and you're able to articulate who you are and what are you trying to get out of somebody or the message you're trying to convey. So I think like don't ever walk in the room with your head down and think that you're at a disadvantage. If you have the information, you're already at an advantage. You have the advantage that you need. So get the information and life will take care of itself.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to my co-panelists, Nigel, Talley, and Dr. Shawan Worsley. We could continue this conversation for probably another hour, but right now I'm going to allow our youth. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see reception, stage, and sessions. You now get to choose the session that you're going to attend, and there are 3 amazing sessions for you to choose from. So I want you to enjoy yourself. I want to say thank you and happy MLK Day.
Happy MLK Day.